Hi, everybody. We're just going to give people a minute to sign on, and we have a few students who are coming into the library. So we'll be introducing our speaker in just a minute. And so this is 6th grade, and there'll be some 8th graders too. Morning. Come on in, and we'll just ask that you sit every other chair, please.
Thank you for letting us do
Of
this.
course.
Super exciting.
Good morning.
Good morning. Every other chair.
And we have a few 8th graders coming down too, so. Come on. Come on in. You can sit in the middle here. Come on in. Are you from Miss Seraphin's class? Yeah, come on in. You guys can come up in the middle here. You can sit in the chairs back there, turn them around. Don't sit on the benches, please. You guys can turn those chairs around if you want to sit in them. So just spread out, please. Up here.
I don't know, my back to you, and you might not see the slides from where I'm sitting. It's probably like not a good spot.
You can come here, come back here.
Come over on that
Right
side.
here. It's a little more comfortable. How about this one right here? There you go.
Just don't want to be rude, have my back to you.
All right, so thank you for our students who are here in the library, and to all of our students at home and in our classrooms here at Troy Middle School. We're going to get started so that we stay right on time. I want to introduce Ms. Kathy Sheehan, who's going to do our presentation for us today, and I'll let her introduce herself and her extensive background and get started. Thank you all for your attention today. We really appreciate it. Feel free, students in the classrooms and teachers, if you have questions throughout the presentation, feel free to put them in the chat, and I will help moderate the chat for questions as we go through the presentation today. And there'll be time at the end for those questions. And we'll encourage all of you who are here in the library to raise your hand and ask questions at the end too, okay? Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, my name's Kathy Sheehan. I am the Rensselaer County and Troy City historian. And I am the educator at the Harklute Museum, right in downtown Troy, right on 2nd Street. We're just a little bit north of Russell Sage College. I always tell everybody we're between Russell Sage College and the Troy Savings Bank Music Hall. So we have 3 buildings on our site. We have a historic house, we have a big research library and exhibition galleries and things like that. So a regular museum. And this program today is, I was telling your principal a few minutes ago when I got to meet him, this is a scavenger hunt for us, and has been a scavenger hunt. I've been there for over 30 years, and the information that we've been finding out about the Underground Railroad, about the abolitionist movement that was going on in Troy and other parts of Rensselaer County, has been amazing, because the information has been coming in little drips and drabs. I mean, we kind of think, I mean, here we are in the library, look at all these books that have so much information on them, and yet we don't have a lot. And so we've had to find it. And some of that reason is because of just because of the way we talk about the movement of the Underground Railroad. It was kind of secret. And yet in some ways, as we've been finding out, up here in Troy, it wasn't so secret. So this really has been an adventure for us. It's a great story. It's something that continues today, because we still work on things like civil rights. We work on what's something we call civil disobedience. How do we protest in a positive way, and when we're not happy with laws that are going on. So these are issues that we still look at today that we were looking at 100 years ago. And so I hope it's kind of a good story. Again, we'll have time for question and answer, but Rebecca has my email. So if some of you think of something the next day, you can certainly just send me a question, and I'd be glad to answer it and help you out as much as I can. So again, this is our story today. All right. It's not working. The technology is that this is. Over to the cursor. So I wanted to, so we've got lots of photos today because I kind of wanted to just give you a context of where things are. So many of you know downtown Troy, or you might even know some of the other parts of Rensselaer County that we're going to talk about. This is Congress Street in around 1850. And I chose that particular year, one, because this is the earliest photographic view that we actually have of Troy. The huge building you see up top, that was called the Troy University, and that's where RPI is right now. So, you know, some of you walk home, going through the campus, the library sits right on that same spot. But what I wanted you to notice was that it's very dense. You can see how busy the city was already at that point, and we had a lot going on. The railroads are coming through. We had a lot of businesses that were here. You had a lot of factories that were coming up, and so it was already starting to get pretty busy down through here. If you've ever had to go to the county office building for anything, that's like right there. So just again, kind of give you a context of what we're looking at. Now there are lots of early in Rensselaer County's history, and a lot of people to hear. We had slavery in New York. Now, when I was going to school, which was a long time ago, we heard that slavery was in the South. Never heard that slavery was going on right here in New York State, right here in Troy. There were slaves, and so that was kind of new. I kind of figured out a little bit after I was in college, but when I was in school, we didn't talk about that. Everything was slavery was in the South, the North was free. Not true. Slavery was not abolished until 1827 here in New York State. Although we do have people who manumitted, or they freed their slaves. And so there's like documents that we have found now over at the State Archives over in Albany, where the State Museum is. This is a Dutch house, and so a lot of the Dutch that were here were slave owners. Some of the biggest slave plantations, and really very similar to what you think of in the South, were right down the river in Schodack, down by Castleton, or up in Schaghticoke. Those were two of the biggest areas. And then around here in Troy, most of the slaves that were here in Troy were people that were domestic servants. They were coachmen, waiters, household servants, or people that worked on the docks. That was pretty much the type of occupations that they used to have slaves that were doing. So that's a Dutch house. That's actually right out in North Greenbush if you ever go out to the tech park. So it's a really early building. So how are we finding out? Remember I said this has been really like a scavenger hunt. We have something in our collections called probate records. And if someone dies, they come in and do all the inventory of all the stuff that is in your house. And the awful thing about this stuff is that at one point before slavery was abolished up here, a Black person who was a slave was considered part of the stuff. I mean, they listed it, if you're looking along here, they're saying baskets of wheat and rye, and right under number 3 on the list, one Negro woman, $75. She's literally listed in between tables and chairs, which is horrible, absolutely horrible. This is how we start to count how many people. Now, here's the other thing, they don't even put her name in. So she's this kind of nameless person who had probably an incredibly important job. And she is listed, and she obviously was young because the amount of money that she is worth right over there is $75, because that was how they valued their worth. Is how much work could we get out of their slave. So oops, is this something's going on here? It's saying something about shutting down. Oop, it shut down. Oops. Technology. Well, let me do. So we've been finding through these. So a few years ago, the courthouse was microfilming all these records, and they said, "Oh, we could throw away all the original documents." We're like, "No, we don't want to do that." So we have them all, and so now we've been studying these early documents to find out what people had, who was in these households, and that was how we found this particular one. It's okay. So, well, we'll just, while we're waiting for this to go out. So by 1799, though, New York State actually passes a gradual emancipation. So they said Black women that were born after 1799 will be free at the age of 25 and Black men at the age of 28. The 1806 census of Troy, we just finished the census in 2020, you were all counted in the census, had 89 free Black citizens. So we also always had a free Black citizen, and they had 79 slaves. That changes dramatically after about 1820. So here's another thing, though. This is pretty cool. We just got these records of the Troy Savings Bank, which used to be where the music hall was. And before that, they were on First Street, which we'll see in a minute. And they have something called a signature book. So if you go to a bank, you know, you get a debit card now. And so you sign this thing. Before, they used to have the signature book. And the very, very first person who signed in at that bank is a Black woman. Her name is Martha Jefferson. She has $40 put in an account in 1823, which is a huge amount of money. The second person, her name is Phoebe Van Rensselaer. We know that Phoebe Van Rensselaer was a slave. She's got $51 in the bank. So this really starts to change the story. It's like, wait a minute. Not only, first off, most women had no rights at all in 1823, whether you're white or Black. But the fact that this is a Black woman who has saved money and earned money and is able to put money in the bank in 1823 is pretty remarkable. We don't know a lot about Martha Jefferson. We've been trying, we're digging. We are trying to find out more about her. Phoebe Van Rensselaer, we did find out. She was a slave. She was manumitted. She was freed. So she became a free Black woman. And she's depositing $51. And she ended up living here. And she came, we've now found out she came up from the Caribbean. And so that's where she was brought in from. So here it is. Here's a bank who has went for 150 years. And the very first two people to deposit in this bank, not only are Black women, they're women. So that's been really exciting for us. So here's a map of Troy. And what you're seeing is the Hudson River. And of course, most of the streets are really pretty much the same as they were in 1850 when this map is done. Again, all those little dots that you see on the screen, and those of you at home, you can see all that. Those are all houses. So you have this very compressed area. It's a really busy area. We need lots of labor to run all the things that were going on the river. So where are all these people coming from as we started to get into being the site where freedom seekers can come to Troy? So we don't want to say escaped slaves anymore, because it's like so they're freedom seekers. They're leaving the South and they want to work their way up. How are they getting here? Well, we've all seen some of the books. You may have read the books. You see the little knapsack and they're hiding under hay bales and things like that. They're obviously using the Underground Railroad, which is this network of houses and things that are connected. Once they get up to like New York City, you're right on the Hudson River and you're coming right up here and getting off on the docks that you can see right along the wharf here. So one of the things that we found is when slavery was abolished, there was a tiny little thing in the paper in 1827, July 6th. I'm just going to read, it's very fast to read. The abolition of slavery. On Wednesday last, the bands of slavery in this state were broken, never again to be united. The colored people of New York and all too of Albany celebrated yesterday. Public procession, tokens of joy. The day had arrived to put a final and lasting period to slavery in this state. And while noticing the extinction thus far of the blot on the fair fame of our country, our common gratitude demands that we should notice a letter from Governor Tompkins. This letter is considered as the principal cause which abolishes slavery throughout our state. And it was July the 4th, of course, of 1827, which of course was Independence Day for everyone else. And there's one other part. There was a wonderful letter to the editor that I found in the paper. Now, because things are digitized, so it's easy to look through some of these papers. And I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but I wanted to talk about this parade. And there was a parade that went down 3rd Street. And they talked about these beautiful banners. And this is one that he talked about particularly. He goes, there was a banner represented an African kneeling to the goddess of liberty, raising her hands while she unfastened the chains which bound them. Another exhibited the guardian goddess of Africa beneath one of her native trees, pensively reclining on a standard with a scroll that said Emancipation, July 4th, 1827. The third was perched an American eagle with outspread wings, and at the foot kneeled an African in the act of receiving from the goddess of liberty a tablet on which was inscribed freedom. But in the distance could be seen the ocean and a dark slave ship hovering upon the coast of Africa. Over 500 people were marching at that parade. Now, back in 1827, 500 people, well, you put 500 people together in any way, so it's a lot of people. 500 people marching together in 1827 that were black citizens from Troy and Albany and Schenectady, all marching down 3rd Street, right over by Dunkin' Donuts. Was really amazing. So this is the bottom of this is the Hudson River right here. And this building right here is the Pliny Moore grain elevator. For those of you at home that couldn't see me point, it's the large building right up in the front. And you see the packet boats in the front. And this is how they were bringing, corn and vegetables and all the goods that were transported, some grown out in Brunswick and Berlin and all the areas of Rensselaer County and Western Vermont and Massachusetts. They were all brought down to Troy and put on these boats, and they would be shipped down to New York City. When they were coming back up, guess what was on them? Freedom Seekers. And the man who owned this place his name was Pliny Moore. Great name. Pliny Moore ran this grain elevator. And so they would get off the boat and he would say, okay, what's going on? What do you need? How can we help you? And so some of the freedom seekers are trying to get to Canada, because at that time, Canada, you're completely free if you get to Canada. Others are like, wait a minute, it's a nice city. We like this. Maybe we'll stay here for a while. Others, now think about it, they were coming up from the south. So what did they need? Warm clothing, right? You need warm clothing. They needed food. They needed shelter. They needed maybe some money. They needed letters to get to the next place. And so Pliny Moore was one of the people he was part of this network. He was also, as we found out, the secretary of the New York State Anti-Slavery Society. So he was in good company. So he'd send them over here to 1st Street. And these buildings that are right here on this spot. Does there occur something? No. Yeah. Then we can. Oh, can I do? Oops. Sorry, I gave it away too fast. So the large building that you see, and the one next door with the horse and the buggy in front of it, that large building was the Athenaeum, and inside the Athenaeum was that first office of the Troy Savings Bank. So think about these freedom seekers. They're coming up. They get into that building where the bank is. They hit a library. There's it was called the Mental and Moral Improvement Society. There was a group of women who were the Female African Benevolent Society. They had an office in that building. And right next door, where the horse and buggy is, that was called the Troy House. It was a hotel. It was an inn. And in that inn was a black man by the name of Peter Baltimore. And Peter Baltimore was a barber. And the barber was one of those professions that you're not just taking care of other black citizens' hair. He was cutting white citizens' hair, and he got very connected with lawyers and some of the white citizens who had a lot of money, who were also supporting the abolitionist movement, that wanted to help him. And they were all coming into this place. And this was, some of you know Sliding Dirty on 1st Street? It was right across the street from that. Literally, if you're sitting outside there and you look across, there's an empty lot there right now. It's only a block away up from the YWCA. And that's where all this was happening So these freedom seekers only came up a couple blocks and they're going over to Peter. What can we do? How can we help you? And the women of this Female African Benevolent Society were really amazing. And I'm just going to read you this one little part. This was one of their excerpts that we found about a few years later. And they go, "Take courage, sisters, in this noble enterprise, remembering that we shall reap if we faint not. The bright star is already beaming upon us. We see in various forms the improvement of our people. And shall we be discouraged in this work? No, sisters. Let our evening be long remembered by us all. We celebrate our 4th anniversary. We think we are engaged in the great cause of emancipation. May our labors be abundantly blessed, and may all societies formed by the colored people remain in harmony and be firmly united in the great cause of benevolence." So they start out with something like, I don't know, $20 in their till, and they end up with hundreds of dollars later on when they're in there. Here's another view of the Troy house. So in this, so these people that felt like they wanted to stay, Peter's like, great. They need some porters, they need some waiters, they need some cooks, they need staff to work, changing beds, things like that. So he would get them jobs. And so this whole little quarter right over there, and it just became so important on how people could get around with everything. So I mentioned letters. This is the most rare thing that you find as we've been looking into the history of this. To actually physically have a letter that has survived someone traveling from house to house and place to place. And this one was found up in Vermont. And it says to Mr. Hicks, it's from 1840, the Anti-Slavery Society, up in Bennington, which is just over the border from here. But they had to go right through, coming up from Troy, right up Hoosick Street, basically. And it says, "Dear sir, please receive the bearer as a friend who needs your aid and direct him on his way. If you cannot give him work, he comes to us well recommended, was a slave a few weeks since. Yours, Abel Brown." Abel Brown was a minister. He was here in Troy. He was out in Sand Lake in Averill Park. He was over in Albany. A lot of you may have heard of the Stephen and Harriet Myers house over in Albany. He was over there too, helping out. And so this letter survived. And one of the people that it was sent through was over to this house right up on Hoosick Street. And it's Hoosick Road, it's way up in Hoosick. And it was called, now it was a little in now. But this was a farmhouse. And it was the Van Hosens. Again, a Dutch name. They had manumitted, they had freed their slaves years and years ago, and they were now helping freedom seekers as they come. And the house is still there. It's up there. Those of you who know Potter Hill Barn, if you go up there, just up past there. And so this is amazing because one of the questions I get all the time, people come in and they look at a house and go, "Oh, our house must be on the Underground Railroad." It's not as easy as that. It's like you have to prove it. And so this is one of those sites you can literally document that this house was about. Now, it didn't mean that they were digging tunnels and that they had things like that. Most people, they might have a room, they might be out in the barn. There's a big barn that was out in the back. It was just a space. The whole thing of tunnels, that didn't happen. Those are stories and myths that came out, or if you've heard about maybe the black square hanging on a quilt. You would never find things that way if people were doing it that way. It really was this network of these friends with notes and with telegrams. That's how people got around. And that's how it really, truly happened. And eventually they would cross over. You're crossing over this is the only covered bridge left in Rensselaer County. It's up in Buskirk, and it crosses up over into Washington County, and then you're zipping right over into Vermont and keep going north, and you're working way up to Canada. That bridge is still there, by the way. You go over there. So then we have a man by the name of Nathan Beeman. Now, if that building looks familiar, you know Russell Sage College. That's the Bush Center, and it's still there. And there was Reverend Nathan Beeman, and he really wanted the Black population to start to have their own church. And so he went out towards Oneida, New York, a little bit out in the west, and he found a Black minister. His name was Reverend Henry Highland Garnett. And he said, "Look, I want you to come here. I want you to have a church. I want you to have this community. He's not the first one. There was actually another smaller church that started by the black men who worked on the shore as working on the docks. They literally formed their own little church in a small space. But this is going to be first official church. And he moved it. They literally took this, not that big building, but there was a little session house, and they picked it up and they put it on lines and they rolled it down to Liberty Street. I don't know if anybody knows that long row of buildings on Liberty Street. It's right between, on Liberty Street between 3rd and 4th Street on the west side. So right across the street from that was this church. And that was what was the old session house. You can imagine they picked it up on lines and moved it in there. That church became the site of these amazing abolitionist meetings. Frederick Douglass, you've all heard about Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was there. They were stuffing 500 people into that building. They were standing outside on the street to hear these conventions. They literally, we really want to track that back, that almost some of the first conventions for what became New York State's, the NAACP, started out of this building right here. And now the building unfortunately burned down. So it was a site. And then you'll see at the very bottom, you see draft riot site. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So the marker is still there. You can see it if you go over to Liberty Street. So here was another page that we found. This is the I just want to point the Female African Benevolent Society. They had, within just a couple of years, $195 that they had in their kitty. So they went from like $20 to $195. That's a lot of support. It's a lot of support for the movement. There was another man who came into town. This is a receipt from William Rich. He's a barber. He's a black man. To shave Mr. Hart, $5.50. How do we get this information? This is in our papers from a man who was part of our museum, 1844. William Rich is an interesting guy. He was a freed black man from Boston and met the Marquis de Lafayette. Now, you may have heard of Lafayette because you watched Hamilton, right? And Lafayette was on this grand tour because the United States wanted to honor him for all the work that he did during the Revolution. Lafayette came to Troy, and with him was William Rich. William Rich was kind of his body guy. He was his hairdresser. He was fix his clothes. He took care of his, all of his kind of stuff. So he was his guy. And he gets to Troy, and the first thing he meets is Peter Baltimore, because they stayed at the Troy House. And he likes Troy so much that he says, bye-bye, Lafayette. He said, you keep going on your tour. I'm staying here. This is where I want to be able to help my fellow Black citizens that are coming through, help the freedom seekers. And so he does. So now we've got Peter Baltimore and William Rich. They're working together. One of the things William Rich was really interested in was education. And he wanted to be sure that not only children were getting an education, but a lot of the adults. A lot of these freedom seekers couldn't read or write. And so he started a school in that same Athenaeum. And then later on in this building right over here, for those of you, it's the Peak building. And he started up, it was an old church. And up in the upper floors, they rented the space. During the day, it was for students, for children. During the evening, it was for adults. He also worked really hard to desegregate schools. When we think about desegregation, you'll hear a lot, you've heard probably a lot about that in the 1950s and 60s. He was talking about it in the 1830s and 40s and continued to work it. And finally, Troy did desegregate the schools in 1874, about 2 years after he died. So he never got to really see that. But he was so important in this whole movement of trying to help, again, trying to help everybody get through. And this is Peter Baltimore. So we never knew. We never knew what Peter Baltimore looked like till about 3 years ago. We get a phone call from this art gallery director guy in Western Massachusetts. He said, I have a watercolor on the back. This is Peter Baltimore. It was done in the 1840s, probably done down in New York City. Now look at this picture. We have a little thing we call, how do you read a photograph? How can we tell a story from looking at a photograph? Well, when you look at Peter, there's a few things that are there's clues. He's holding a pen. He's holding a paper. Those were clues that he was literate. He could read and write. He's very well dressed. He's got a very fitted waistcoat, his tie. He's sitting in a very nice chair. Look at his hair. It's completely, fixed very nicely. This is a well-educated man. And it's a very, very rare piece. We've literally had museums from all around the country that want to borrow this for exhibitions. We're like, no, can't use it now. But someday we will. Maybe if the Met calls us one day, we'll have. So here he is. This is Peter. So here's Peter and William Rich working with, and Pliny Moore. We don't know what Pliny Moore, the guy that had the great elevator, we don't know what he looked like. They are just working tirelessly on this project. So I mentioned Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was brought in. He met Peter. Peter met Frederick Douglass many times down in New York City. And he's the one who convinced him to come up to Troy. And they went to this, they had, let's have a big rally, big meeting. So Frederick Douglass comes and speaks up here at Rand's Opera House, right on the corner of Congress Street and 3rd. Rand's Opera House held 1,000 people. Frederick Douglass came up at least 4 times that we know of, that he came up to speak. Here's what that's what the inside of Rand's theater looked like. It was a huge, huge place. And this is what it is now. Y'all know what it is? That's the Dunkin' Donuts. So unfortunately, the building burned down in the 1960s. But right on that spot, you literally can stand in that spot and say, this is where Frederick Douglass was. And he was here. And that's why he realized how important Troy was to this whole movement that was going on in the country. Troy was like the center of this. So then we come up, 1850. Things start to change. Now, up until this time, they put things in the paper. They would write, these little ads. They would say, we're having the state convention of colored people. Frederick Douglass is coming here. It was all in the papers, little ads. They talked about the vigilant committees. How many people will we help? How much money have we saved to help these people? It was in the papers. And then 1850 happened. Fugitive Slave Act. And what happened with the Fugitive Slave Act is, let me just find my sheet. So here's what happens. This is what happens. Any federal marshal who did not arrest an alleged runaway slave could be fined $1,000. That's another word for a bounty hunter. They were out to do that. People suspected of being a runaway slave could be arrested without a warrant. So you're a black person, you walk down the street, we might just nail you. A suspected black slave could not ask for a jury trial nor testify on his or her own behalf. Any person aiding a runaway slave by providing shelter, food, or any other form of assistance could be jailed for up to 6 months and be charged a $1,000 fine. So that changes the story now. So all this stuff that's going on in Troy, now it literally has to go underground. And that brings us to April of 1860. We have this man. His name was Charles Dow. Charles Dow had escaped from Virginia. He worked his way up on the network on the Underground Railroad, was out in Averill Park, working as a coachman for a man by the name of Horace Averill. Horace Averill started writing letters for Charles and sending them back to the South because Charles wanted his family to know that he was okay. And somehow they were able to do this, which is still remarkable. Horace Averill now is like, I could make some money off of this. I know he's a freedom seeker. I know he was escaped. So he turns it in under this Fugitive Slave Act. And all this kind of takes a little bit of time. So either we don't quite know yet what happened on this end, but Charles, somehow he had probably figured out what was going on with Mr. Averill. He leaves him, comes to Troy, and works out of this house right over here with this big stairs, right on Washington Park, right on 2nd Street. He works for a man by the name of Uri Gilbert. Uri Gilbert was a coach manufacturer. He had these beautiful coach interiors. And he actually was Mrs. Gilbert's coachman. That was a very typical job for black citizens at that time, black men to be coachmen. And so he's her coachman. So he leaves, walks out these stairs, goes across the street one morning just to go get some bread. This is this Jewish synagogue right on 3rd Street Division, right near Redfront. That little tiny building next door, there was another wooden building there on that site. It was a small grocery store. He goes in to get his bread, and 2 marshals arrest him. And they grab him and they arrest him under the Fugitive Slave Act. And they literally put him in chains and shackles, and they start dragging him up 2nd Street. back over a block away from the music hall. And they bring him up. This is, look at all, this was in the paper. And who's up there that shows up into town that day? It's Harriet Tubman. Hold on, let me get to the other picture a minute. There's a picture. They drag him up into this building, which is right here. Still there. This is kitty corner from the YWCA, right on First and State. Up here, right here, this room up there. And that's where the judge is. And now, here's what's going on. In the 5-6 minutes that it took them to drag him up those 5-6 blocks, church bells start ringing. 1,000 people gather right outside here. And they're all going, oh my God, they got Charles. And Peter, you go back now a minute. Yeah, here's all, this is an illustration. Peter, he's over at the barbershop, which is right around the corner. And he goes in his pocket, he goes in his hands, and he goes, I have $250. He can't get through the crowd. He can't get through the crowd. So he goes behind the building, down the alley, you know, all the alleys in Troy, and he finds this other white lawyer. His name is Martin Townsend. He goes, Martin, I have $250. And Martin says, I have $250, and there's such a crowd out here, we'll be able to raise the other $250. We can free Charles. That's what was the bounty at that point. You could pay yourself off, $650. Well, by the time they get upstairs to that building, up there, they've raised the bounty to over $1,000. They had no intention of letting Charles free. They were setting Charles up as an example. It's like, you don't do this. You're not going to disobey this fugitive slave law. And so who happens to be in town that day but Harriet Tubman? Harriet Tubman was visiting her cousin who lived on 2nd Street. His name was John Hooper. He was also part of the Underground Railroad. She's in town. So she works herself up. She works her way up to up there. There's a picture of her hanging out the window. She's trying to help free Charles. At one point during this whole thing, poor Charles literally tries to jump out the window. He figures, I'm jumping. He's like, I got to figure out a way to escape. Off the 3rd floor. And they grab him in. Again, remember, he's got shackles on his ankles, and he's got handcuffs on his wrist, and the poor man is hanging like a fish on a hook. And they drag him back in, breaking one of his ankles in the process as they drag him in. So as the bounty hunters are bringing him down the stairs, there's a couple of ways this story has been told. They said that Harriet Tubman either took her petticoat and threw it over the head of the guard and was able to get Charles away. Another one said she locked her arms between her and Charles. They managed to get him away, and they run like hell down First Street, put him on a boat, and they go across the Hudson River. He's captured again on the other side. Y'all know where McDonald's is over Waterloo? Right there. He's captured again right at that spot. There's a whole other group of people that had managed to free him from that situation, and they end up hiding him out way out in Schenectady County up in Niskayuna for about 4 months until the rest of the money was raised. And they did raise the money. Now here's the funny part of that whole thing. Mary Gilbert, the guy he worked for, he could have written that check in about 5 seconds, and he held off, which was always haunted him after that. He did end up putting some money in afterwards, but they finally raised the money and they freed Charles. He comes back and stays in Troy until after the Civil War ends. And then he goes back down to Virginia gets reunited with his family. Never said a word about what happened to him. He never told that story. Now you have this man who couldn't read or write, had been a slave, was finally freed, and goes back and does his job. You know what his son became? His son goes to school, to college, and becomes the first Black superintendent of the schools in Washington, D.C. The son of a slave. And he never knew that story until, for some reason, he came back up here and he was in Troy in the 1920s, and he heard about what happened to his father. And his father had died at that point. So he never knew. He said, oh my gosh, what an extraordinary thing. He said, what did my father always say? He said, we had to have education. And he was determined. He said, he was so determined that I needed to go to school. And he did. And what a success he made. So an incredible story. There's a wonderful book. It's called Freeing Charles by a good friend of mine wrote it. His name was Scott Christensen. He unfortunately passed away a few years ago. So I told you the little nickel version. He's got it's a whole other thing. So at some point you might want to read it. It's good. Some of the other people that we don't face this for, but again, women. This is a Black woman. Her name is Mary Boastman. She becomes assistant principal and eventually becomes principal of what they termed as the colored school, the William Rich School, that when she was over there. She went to Troy High. She's a Troy High graduate. Really, very spunky woman. And at some point she ends up in Washington, D.C. later on too. And but she's buried up here in Oakwood Cemetery. So then, now we're in the middle of the Civil War, right? That was April 1860 when Charles died. 3 years later, the horrors of war will do very strange things to people. And Lincoln had enacted the draft. So basically what that meant is that any man that was 18 years or older, you had to serve. You had no choice. You don't want to do that. Now, in Troy at that time, we had a large Irish population that had settled in. They were immigrants that came off. You probably read about it, the potato famine in 1848. So a lot of immigrants came here. They're working in South Troy at the factories. The women are working in the collar factories right down to the foot of River Street. And so they're not paying attention to what was going on down south. They frankly didn't care. Well, I should say they didn't care. They were too busy working, trying to make a living, trying to make money. And now all at once, President Lincoln is saying, wait, you got to go fight. But if you have $350, you can sign off on it. You can send somebody else. If you can have the $300, we'll send somebody else that you can get paid off. Well, that was like more than a year's wages for most of those people. So this all boiled over, and again, this is not a right way to think, but this is what happened at the time. They're thinking, wait a minute, we're going down there to fight a war, and we're seeing our friends coming back with their, legs blown off, arms blown off. They can't work, or worse than that, they were killed during the war. Our families aren't going to survive. And while we're going off to fight the war, the Black people that are here in Troy are now going to take my job at the factory. And this all escalated, and they got very, very angry. And so they started a riot. And this didn't happen just in Troy. It happened in New York City as well. Troy was the second worst city, though, for these riots. And so before you know it, there's 1,000 men marching up First Street and Second Street, and they're going to destroy anything that had to do with the abolitionist movement. There was a newspaper called the Troy Daily Times. It was over on River Street. They took the presses and threw them in the river. Martin Townsend, they looted his house. Peter Baltimore, he had to escape to Waterford and hide out because they knew he was so involved. So he had to escape with his family and go over there. This is a notice in the paper about the drafts were suspended. The Times office is, this is just what was happening and how they talked about this. And then there's this man right here, Charles Gidney, third. Those of you from home, is the third person from the right sitting down. He has the white beard, very elegant gentleman, Black man. His name is Charles Gidney. And we found a letter a few years ago in our collection down at the museum. Again, we have thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of documents. And so not everything, we're still uncovering things from years ago. We find this document, and this is a letter. Nobody has letters like this, not even the big museums and stuff. We have it. And it's dated to the mayor of the city of Troy. William Van Alstyne is the mayor. Honorable sir, as I learned that you are in town, I now inform you of my grief, and no doubt all the rest of my people are under the same grievances. I have been advised by white gentlemen and ladies to stay in my house and not to be seen in the streets because it is not safe. The Irish mob was going about seeking the colored people's lives. Since the mob, I cannot go out to get groceries, but there's something thrown at my head. I have been in my house for 2 days. We are afraid of our lives being destroyed. Therefore, I pray to you for protection so that I may walk the streets undisturbed. You know that I cannot live without my daily labor. And even yesterday, little boys stood before my door at a short distance, and my wife stood in her door, and they stood there with clubs, shaking their clubs at her. I pray you to forthwith put out a proclamation against all offenses so that we colored people may walk the streets in perfect peace. Yours most respectfully, Charles Gidney. Quite a letter. Just gives you that sense of how awful this was. That Liberty Street Presbyterian Church that I talked to you about, that you saw the little tiny, they wanted to burn it down. And they almost succeeded. The mob of 1,000 people came up with the torches. They were going to burn it down, but there was a priest standing there. His name was Father Haverman. Father Haverman had started all the Catholic churches in Troy. So he knew a lot of these people. And he's like, look, you have to stop. You're not going to have to worry about getting shot down in the south in the north. They called out the militia from the Watervliet Arsenal. They're on their way over here, and you're going to get shot before you leave now. So disperse. So he managed to get them to leave. They did not burn the Liberty Street Church down, and it continued, of course, for many, many years. This is the actual letter that he wrote. And as it turns out, as we've been finding more information about Charles Gidney, he was a noted mathematician working on pi, 3.114, something like that. So we're still trying to find out more about Charles, but an incredible letter. Jumping ahead really quickly into the 20th century, this is Vanderheim Home, which used to be called the Troy Orphan Asylum. And one of the most noted Black women in our country lived at Vanderheim from the time she was 5 months old. She went to Troy High School. Her name was Dr. Lavinia Brown. I don't know if you've heard of Dr. Lavinia Brown. Lavinia Brown is the first female Black surgeon in the country. And after she went to Troy High, she went down to Tennessee, and that's where she did all her medical training. She became the first Black woman to serve on the Tennessee Assembly. She was the first Black woman to serve in the Tennessee House of Representatives. She was in charge during World War II of the medical corps. That was part of her group. Quite an astounding woman. She always talked about how wonderful she had been treated at Vanderheim Hall, at what was then known as the Troy Orphan Asylum. And that there was a doctor there, we haven't figured out who the doctor was, who treated her for a tonsillectomy. She had to have her tonsils out. And that was how she got interested in medicine as a little girl, living here at the Troy Orphan Asylum. So we go into the 20th century, and we have the forming of what was the NAACP. These are some notices that we're seeing in the papers. This is 20. There's Peter Baltimore. This was actually his obituary. Peter Baltimore's son, talking about the education, Peter Baltimore's son was Garnett Douglas Baltimore. He is the person who landscaped Prospect Park, which is 2 blocks from here. He also was a city engineer, a landscape engineer for the city of Troy. He did landscape work for up at Oakwood Cemetery. His wife was a big movement for the suffrage movement. So the Baltimore family continued on for a long time. One of the issues we're talking about in the 1920s was housing for the Black population that was here. There was discrimination that was going on. You'll hear more about it, and we're working on another packet about that. George Biddle Kelly, here he is. George Biddle Kelly he becomes the first president of the Troy NAACP. Now, this is the Bethel Baptist Church, not the one that you might know on Fifth Avenue. This was the one that actually burnt down in the 60s. And this man is Reverend Stinney. Reverend Stinney is my hero. He's an amazing man. I grew up here in Troy, lived here my whole life. Grew up on 17th Street for 25 years. I lived 3 doors away from the high school. I did not know this story until one of Reverend Stinney's parishioners told me about it. So as the civil rights movement was kicking in the 1950s, and there was horrible discrimination and treatment of Black citizens in the South, down in Mississippi, they were sharecroppers. They weren't paid their fair wages. They were living in horrible housing conditions. And Reverend Stinney said, we have to help these people. We have to get them out of this situation. So he would go around to neighbors in not just in his parishioners of the Bethel Baptist Church, but other people. He said, look, can you put up a family? Will you host a family for about a month until we get them a job, get them food, get them clothing, and everything else? So all these families agreed. So he would get 4 or 5 cars together, and they would pack up the cars with chicken and food and water, gasoline, empty coffee cans. And I'll tell you why in a minute. And they would drive down to the South. They would go to Mississippi, they go to Carolinas, they go to Virginia. They were picking up people whole families that needed to be rescued. This is like a modern underground railroad. This wasn't in the 1850s. This is 1959, 1960, 61, 62. I was a kid. This is going on. And they would escape sometimes under getting shot at, under cover of darkness. And so they would get in the car and they would not stop. They would not stop at all. That's why they need the empty coffee cans. If you need to pee, you got to pee in the coffee can because we're not stopping anywhere on the way back. They didn't feel comfortable stopping until they're back up in like New Jersey. That was the first time they would stop. And then he'd bring these families to Troy. And then he would get the men jobs down at the Burned Iron Works or over at the Watervliet Arsenal. And the women would get jobs wherever they need, whatever do. Find housing, get them settled. When they all got settled, they did it all again. And this went on for years. And there are whole families, I'm sure some of you are hearing this now, they're probably talking to your grandparents, and I hope you will contact me because we want to hear these oral histories, because now a lot of these people who are part of what Reverend Stinney are maybe in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. They may have been young children, and they came up through here on this. He was an incredible, what a force, what an amazing thing. It really was a modern underground railroad. And it just still continues that today. And then, of course, there's another page that talks about the different Andy churches and marking the things. So we're looking to find this other information. It comes in different forms. It comes in all sorts of different ways. It's a continuing story. And thank you all for letting me tell you this, of what's going on here. Any questions locally or if things are coming up?
I'm just going to turn off this screen share so you can see.
I know we haven't come back. Again, you can all email me if there's something that pops in your head. I'd be glad to answer them.
So at this time, if anyone in our classrooms have any questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat and I'll moderate. Any students here have any questions?
And
A lot of
it's a lot of information.
Did people recognize some of the places in Troy from? Yeah.
Yeah. It's kind of amazing to know all that happened right on places that we walk. You know, our museum is only a block away from that Dunkin' Donuts, and every time I go past that, I was like, wow, can you imagine what that must have been like to be here or to walk down Liberty Street? You know, I hope at some point, I know when COVID relaxes a little bit, we can take an actual walking tour, which we do that. We can take your classes. We can come do an actual walking tour down and go to the different sites. There is I think I sent it to you, the Rescue of Charles Dall as a play. You could do it as a play here in school. Yeah. Thank you all so much for giving me your time today. I appreciate it so much.
Great. Thank you so much. We're going to make an announcement just for our teachers about where our students can go. So just hold on tight. If there's any other questions, you can feel free. And if the chat isn't working, I think it is, you can unmute yourself to ask any questions too. Thank you all so much. We really appreciate it. Thank you, Ms. Sheehan, so much for all this information and this great story.
Yeah, it is.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Cool. We have what, about 3 minutes?
Yeah.
Wow, I could have gone 3 more minutes. I was leaving time for questions. It's all right.
Good morning, Troy Middle School. Pardon the interruption. So the Black History Month presentation has concluded. At this time, students may rotate to their second period classes quietly and calmly. Thank you so much and have a rockin' rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Great.
Thank you. Oh, you're welcome. Have a great day, everybody. Enjoy.
I'm just gonna run to the and just stop the stream. This is your ID
Oh, great. Thank you.
and your visitor pass.
Oh, that always helps.